Okay, so we now come to a heap of applications. The first one is in fact very short, and that's concerning the question why firms issue new shares or new financing titles, especially when market conditions are good, independent of their own financial condition, or let's rather say independent of the quality of the project itself. So, uh, observation is that firms issue shares when the stock prices are high already. And does not seem to depend only on the NPV of the project. And one possible explanation would be, now that we're talking about adverse selection, hidden information, that this hidden information problem is less relevant or less severe during booms. So let's try a very short model extension. It's only this slide actually. And let's just assume that in good times, um, that the success probability of all firms is of all types, good types and bad types, shifted upwards by some positive number tau. And this shift is publicly observable. So still, whether a firm is good or bad is not observable, but whether a firm, this additional shift, this additional positive probability is observable. So now the condition for financing, remember that a couple of slides ago we had this condition that said MR has to be larger or equal than I. Now the condition is M plus tau times R has to be larger or equal than I. So that just means that in these boom times, if the additional tau applies, then this financing condition is relaxed, so there is more financing. Okay. Very simple, not very much going on. So let's move right away to the next application, which is called assets in place. It's a little bit comparable to the debt overhang problem, but remember, debt overhang problem is that has a moral hazard problem, and it has three parties, and that's different here. So let's look at the situation. We have an entrepreneur that initially owns all of the shares. We could also think of a situation that would just be a different interpretation, more or less the same model, where the shareholder has already sold some shares, but there's shareholder value implemented. So the shareholder, or the not the shareholder, sorry, the entrepreneur has already sold part of the shares, but because of shareholder value, he acts on behalf of the shareholders. And what we want to understand is the stock price reaction upon the announcement of an equity issue. So the interesting fact is, and that's indeed one, maybe you should think about this a little bit before we go through the discussion of the model. The fact is that on average, when there is an equity announcement of an equity issue, that typically the share price goes down. So there are at least two questions that we can ask. And one question is, why does it go down? I mean, if we issue new shares, that should typically mean that we have an interesting new project, investment project. This new project should have positive NPV, otherwise I would not try to get the finance. So I issue shares for a reason. Why does the share price go down? That's one interesting question. And the other question is, why does the entrepreneur decide to issue new shares if the share price goes down? Shouldn't he rather do something that makes the share price increase and not let the share price go down? Those are questions that we can answer with this, again, extension of the model. So let's assume that we already have a project in place. So the firm is already an ongoing concern. But there is now a deepening investment. And this deepening investment costs I. I personally would have called it J rather than I, or some other letter, because I, that could also refer to something that has already happened in the past. Um, some initial investment. Okay, now it's the add-on investment. And this I raises the success probability by some value tau. And we assume that tau times R is larger than I, so that means that this deepening investment has a positive NPV. So it's profitable no matter whether you're a good firm or a bad firm, good type or a bad type. And that is something, remember, that the investors don't know, the outsiders don't know. Entrepreneur has no cash on hand herself, and the argument that we will make is that issuing new shares, relinquishing new shares, is less costly for investors that already have overvalued shares. So the idea is that if you're an investor that has overvalued shares, that means that you're a bad type because the share price is the average share price. So therefore, if you're a bad type, then you have overvalued shares. If you're a good type, then you have undervalued shares. But if you have overvalued shares, that means that you can issue new shares at a good price, at a high price. So that's nice for you. So that means that the cost of issuing new shares is relatively higher for good types and lower for bad types. So therefore, issuing new shares somehow sends a signal to the market that you're really a bad type. Okay, and um, that's kind of the gist of the model. The question is still, why should you send a signal to the market that you're in fact a bad type? So these are questions that you see that you can try to understand, that you can try to address with a closed model. You could also try to answer these questions with some blah, blah, blah. But then it's more difficult to check whether the answer that you're giving is consistent. So therefore, of course, we have to stick to the model. All right. So so that was already step one of our model discussion, the extension of the model. So we don't have very much. We just have this add-on project, and that's all that we have. Now, if the entrepreneur issues new shares, how much money does he need? Well, we have, or she, we have assumed that she doesn't have any money herself, so she needs I, and she needs to offer some repayment R1 that could come in form of dividends or something like that. We can talk about that later. And the probability that she can pay is the original M plus tau times R1. If we are in an equilibrium where the investors cannot differentiate between good and bad types. Okay, I'll write that down here in uh, pooling. Pooling equilibrium. So the word pooling equilibrium just means that in equilibrium where investors are unable to differentiate between the good and the bad type, whereas the opposite, we'll also talk about that. That's the separating equilibrium, where information is enough or behavior is such that we can, or the investors can differentiate between the good and the bad type. Well, uh, in this kind of equilibrium, the stake R1 must be so high that M plus tau times R1 times the stake is larger or equal to I. And because of our assumption concerning the bargaining power, this is actually an equality sign. So M plus tau times R1 has to be equal to I. So therefore we can calculate that R1 is simply I over m plus tau. So um, we can now calculate a condition under which the good type, the good entrepreneur, is willing to issue new shares in the first place. He has already a good project, and if he issues new shares, he's kind of selling part of this good project. So the question is it worth it? Well, if he's not issuing new shares, then there is no deepening investment. So therefore, he's just going to get, or she's just going to get, either for herself or for the old shareholders, alternative interpretation, P times R. P is the high success probability. If she does the deepening investment, it's pretty good. She gets, or let's check, she gets something with probability P plus tau. Because of the deepening investment, she increases her success probability, but she gets less of the pie, only R minus R1. And then we can enter this R1, sorry, that we've just calculated here, the R1, enter it into the equation and solve for R or for I, and we get a condition, this condition here. If this condition 6.1 holds, then the good borrower is going to issue new shares. So, and the bad borrower wants to issue shares anyway because for her, issuing shares is cheap. So she wants to issue shares anyway. So therefore, both types will want to issue shares. So that means if this condition holds, we will be in fact in a pooling equilibrium. Whereas if the condition fails to hold, then the good borrower will not want to issue shares and we will be in a separating equilibrium. We will discuss that in detail. Okay, what happens in the pooling equilibrium? In both types do an equity offering. Now, the deepening investment is anticipated. So now this is interesting. The value of the shares before and after this equity offering is m plus tau times R minus I. Why is that? Here, this is the time axis. Time. This is share price. Let's call it uppercase P. And the share price is equal to the aggregate firm value. How much is that? And here, let's say this is the date of the announcement. Announcement written with a double N. Announcement date. Okay. So a value of an initial share. If you're an initial shareholder, you don't have to pay any additional money. Or if you're the entrepreneur, we can identify this initial shareholder with the entrepreneur. She's not going to pay any additional money. So the value for her is going to be m plus tau times R, because there is the, or rather say, let's 1 second back. We don't know. The market does not know whether it's a good or a bad firm. So after the announcement, the price is going to be equal to m plus tau times R minus, of course, the I, the average value of the project minus the additional debt that you have, this value of I, because of the initial investment. So you have to subtract that. And it's the average success probability that applies here, because from the fact that the entrepreneur makes the announcement that she wants to issue new shares, there's no information contained in that. So everybody already anticipates that she's going to issue new shares. And therefore, as a consequence, there is no information. So therefore, also there is no price reaction. So she's going to the microphone. She says, we want to issue new shares. The market will say, well, what's the news? No new information. So there is no share price reaction. Okay. Okay, so what happens in the second case if we have a separating equilibrium? So if 6.1 is violated, then the good types do not raise funds, but the bad borrowers, they will still do so, even though their share price is going to decrease. Why is the share price going to decrease, even though they have a positive NPV project that will go on? Well, it has to decrease because on average the share price has to stay the same. The good entrepreneurs, they will reveal their true type, the good type, so their share price has to increase. So therefore, for the bad borrowers, share price has to decrease. Okay. Why don't they? Why will they still issue new shares if they know that their share price will decrease? Well, that's because they know that the market believes, until they go to the microphone, the market still believes that they have an average success probability of M. They themselves already know that their own success probability is just Q times Q. Okay? So therefore, they say, okay, if I don't do anything, then the value of my firm is going to be Q times R. If I do the deepening investment, it's going to be Q plus tau times R minus I, which is larger because of the assumption that the add-on investment has a positive NPV. Okay, so for the bad types, it is beneficial to carry out this additional investment, even though the share price decreases. Okay, that's an interesting insight, I think. All right, so that implies that the investors, they now understand that if a firm wants to issue new shares, then it has to be a bad type. So therefore now this R1 can have an index B. B stands for bad. And now it's a new break-even condition that says Q times tau and not M, Q plus tau, not M plus tau, times R1B has to be equal to I. Okay. So that makes the shares even more expensive. So that means that the good borrowers do not want to raise funds. So we can show that because from the perspective of a good borrower, um, if they don't issue shares, they will get P times R. If they do issue shares, P plus tau times R minus R1B. Now the price is even higher, so the condition becomes even stricter. Okay, so we get a new condition 6.2, which will always hold if 6.1 will hold. Okay, so therefore good types will not issue shares, and therefore there will be a negative price reaction. So what's the value of the share after the announcement? Well, after the announcement, the value of a share will be V1, or we could also write V1 bad. It's Q plus tau times R minus I because I've now revealed that I'm a bad type. If I announce that I do not want to issue shares, it's V1 good. That's equal to just P times R. Okay. And before the announcement, the value will thus be some average number. So it's going to be alpha times PR plus 1 minus alpha times the other value. Okay, so it's going to be some average. so that on average the share price remains the same. Has to be the same that way because the market participants are risk neutral. So if on average the share price would increase, they would jump on the shares, they would buy the shares and drive up the value even before the announcement. Okay, so let's go back to this picture. What happens? So the blue thing here is the pooling equilibrium. So I'm going to write that up. Pooling equilibrium. Now I choose a different color. Let's take green for the separating equilibrium. Is the initial share price before the announcement, is that higher or lower in the separating equilibrium? I write separating. Well, in pooling, all of the firms carry out the positive NPV project. In separating, it's only the bad firms. Good firms, they have a higher price after the announcement. So this is P times R. This is Q plus tau times R minus I. And the price either goes up or down at the date of the announcement. And originally the price is alpha times PR plus 1 minus alpha times dot 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 times this thing here down here. Okay? So this is what's happening in equilibrium. I think it's a very beautiful result. You go to the microphone, you do announce that you want to issue new shares, and even though the market knows that the project that you want to finance with the new shares has a positive NPV, the market value of the shares goes down. Why? Because the fact that you had access to such a project, it was already anticipated by the market, and now the only information that's conveyed to the market, it's not about the NPV of the project, it's only about your own type. So you're revealing your own type, and that leads to a positive or negative market reaction. Okay, so the equilibrium would look a little bit different if we assumed that the market does not yet know exactly how high the NPV of the add-on project is. That would be a different model, or slightly different at least. So if we assume, for example, that we don't yet know the tau, we only know some ex-ante distribution f of tau, but we don't know the tau exactly, then at the time when you go to the microphone and you announce that you want to do a share issue, then you convey two types of information. One piece of information is that you in fact have a pretty positive add-on project, and the other one is that you're a bad type. So then two types of information are mixed, and then everything becomes a little bit more complicated. Okay, first real application. You see, there's a lot of stuff going on in these asymmetric information models.